I still remember the moment my phone buzzed in my hand, the screen lighting up with a message that felt heavier than it should have been. It was early evening, the kind of quiet hour when the house settles into itself and memories tend to wander freely. The message was short, painfully polite, and carefully worded, but its meaning cut deep. Please don't expect us for Christmas 2025. We've made other plans. It came from my son, my own child. For a few seconds, I just stared at the words, rereading them as if they might rearrange themselves into something warmer, something that sounded less final. Christmas had always been our time. The one season when no matter how busy life became, we found our way back to the same table, the same rituals, the same stories told year after year. Or at least, that's what I believed. I sat there longer than I'd like to admit, the phone resting on my palm, my thumb hovering uselessly over the screen. I didn't know whether to reply immediately, or let the silence speak for me. The house felt unusually large, every tick of the clock echoing through the rooms like a reminder that time keeps moving whether you're ready or not. Outside, the neighbors' lights flickered on one by one, ordinary lives unfolding without any idea that my world had just tilted slightly off its axis. I wasn't angry at first. That came later. What I felt in that moment was confusion, a quiet disbelief mixed with a sadness I didn't yet have words for. I began replaying the past few years in my mind, searching for clues, for signs I might have missed. Had I said something wrong? Had I overstepped, or worse, had I not been present enough? Parenthood, I've learned, doesn't come with a clear rulebook, especially once your children are grown. You're expected to let go, to respect boundaries, to step back gracefully, even when your heart hasn't caught up with the idea. I thought I had done that. I thought I had learned how to love from a distance without making it feel like abandonment or control. Yet here I was, holding a message that felt like a closed door. Christmas, for me, has never just been a date on the calendar. It's been the scent of cinnamon and pine, the sound of familiar laughter filling the kitchen, the comfort of knowing that for at least one day, we were all exactly where we belonged. Even when money was tight or life felt uncertain, Christmas was the anchor that kept us steady. I remembered my son as a child, waking up before dawn, shaking me awake with excitement, insisting that it was time even when the sky was still dark. Those memories surfaced now, uninvited and vivid, making the present feel even colder by comparison. As the initial shock faded, questions began to crowd my thoughts. Who were these other plans? Why did it sound so formal, so distant, like a business email instead of a message from a son to his mother? I wondered if this decision had been made quickly, or if it had been discussed quietly for months without me ever knowing. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from realizing conversations are happening about you, without you. It makes you feel like a spectator in your own family story, watching scenes unfold from behind a glass wall. I didn't reply that night. Instead, I placed the phone face down on the table and let myself sit with the discomfort. I walked through the house, touching familiar objects as if to reassure myself that this life, this history, was still real. The framed photos on the wall smiled back at me. Frozen moments of happiness that felt both comforting and cruel. I told myself that this was just one Christmas, just one decision, and that it didn't erase everything that came before. But deep down, I sensed that this message was about more than a holiday. It was a signal, a turning point I hadn't seen coming. As I went to bed, sleep refused to come easily. My mind kept circling the same thought. When did love become something that needed scheduling, negotiation, and disclaimers? I wasn't looking for sympathy or obligation. I just wanted connection. The simple reassurance that I still mattered in my son's life in a way that went beyond polite messages and distant plans. That night, staring into the dark, I realized this story wasn't just about Christmas 2025. It was about everything that had led up to this moment, and everything that might come after. And whether I liked it or not, I knew I would have to face it head-on. The next morning, I woke up with that familiar heaviness in my chest, the kind that tells you yesterday wasn't just a bad dream. The message was still there, unchanged, waiting quietly on my phone like it had all night. I read it again, slower this time, trying to hear my son's voice behind the words, trying to imagine his expression when he typed them. Was he tired? Distracted? Relieved to finally say it out loud? Or was this simply easier than having a real conversation? I made my coffee and stood by the kitchen window, watching steam rise from the mug, as if it might carry my thoughts away with it. This kitchen had seen so much life: late-night talks, hurried breakfasts, birthday cakes baked at the last minute. Standing there alone, I felt the contrast sharply, as if the room itself noticed what was missing. As the hours passed, I began to feel something shift inside me. The sadness didn't disappear, but it changed shape. It became reflective, pulling memories to the surface whether I wanted them or not. I remembered the years when my son was building his own life, how proud I had been of his independence. How often I reminded myself not to interfere, not to become that parent. I gave advice only when asked, kept my opinions gentle, swallowed my worries with a smile. When he moved away, I told myself distance didn't mean disconnection. We spoke on holidays, shared photos, exchanged updates that sounded complete, but somehow never quite were. Looking back now, I wondered if I had mistaken politeness for closeness. I thought about his partner, too, and the subtle changes that came after she entered his life. Nothing dramatic, nothing openly hostile, just small shifts that were easy to ignore. Shorter visits, conversations that felt slightly guarded, plans that were always tentative, always "we'll see." I had told myself this was normal, that families evolve and roles change. Still, there had been moments when I felt like a guest instead of a mother, carefully choosing my words, afraid of saying the wrong thing. I wondered if this Christmas message was the result of all those small moments piling up, forming a decision I hadn't been invited into. By midday, I realized I couldn't sit with these thoughts forever without doing something about them. I considered calling him, but fear held me back. What if my voice betrayed too much emotion? What if he sounded impatient, or worse, indifferent? I didn't want to beg for an invitation, or make him feel guilty. Love, I believed, shouldn't have to plead. Instead, I took a walk, letting the rhythm of my steps calm my thoughts. The neighborhood looked ordinary, comforting in its predictability. Children rode their bikes, couples walked dogs. Life continued uninterrupted, reminding me that my pain, while real, was also private. As I walked, I started asking myself harder questions, ones I'd avoided for years. Had I been holding on to an image of family that no longer existed? Had I tied too much of my identity to being needed, to being included? It's a strange thing to realize that the role you once filled so naturally can slowly disappear without any clear ending. No announcement, no argument, just a quiet fading. And perhaps this message was simply the most honest expression of that change. By the time I returned home, something unexpected happened. Alongside the hurt, I felt a spark of resolve. I didn't like the way this situation made me feel small, as if my importance depended entirely on someone else's plans. I reminded myself of the life I had built beyond motherhood, the friendships I maintained, the routines that brought me comfort, the strength I had developed over decades of adapting and enduring. I wasn't just waiting on the sidelines of my son's life. I was living my own, even if I had sometimes forgotten that. That evening, instead of responding right away, I opened a notebook and began to write. Not a message to him, but to myself. I wrote about my expectations, my disappointments, and the quiet fear of being left behind. Putting the words on paper felt grounding, like reclaiming a part of myself that had gone silent. I realized that whatever happened next, whether this distance grew or eventually softened, I would need to face it with honesty, not denial. As I closed the notebook, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end of the story. It was a chapter, painful and confusing, but also revealing. The message about Christmas had forced me to confront truths I'd been avoiding, about family, about change, and about my own resilience. And while I still didn't know how or when I would reply to my son, I understood that my response would need to come from a place of self-respect, not fear. Whatever the future held, I was determined not to let this moment define me as unwanted or invisible. That night, sleep came in fragments. I drifted off only to wake again, my mind replaying old conversations, searching for clues I might have missed. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, I realized how long it had been since I'd truly allowed myself to feel disappointed in my son. Mothers are taught to forgive before they are even wronged, to smooth over hurt with understanding, to say he didn't mean it like that. But lying there in the quiet dark, I finally admitted the truth to myself. His words had cut deeply, not because of the holiday itself, but because of what they implied. That my presence was optional, even inconvenient. The following day, I decided to do something I hadn't done in years. I opened old photo albums. Not the digital ones that live quietly on a phone, but the heavy albums tucked away in a closet, their pages thick with time. There he was as a baby, wrapped in a blanket much too big for him. There he was on his first day of school, missing 2 teeth and grinning like he owned the world. I remembered how fiercely I had protected him. How my life had once revolved entirely around his needs. Looking at those photos now, I wasn't angry, I was grieving. Grieving the closeness I thought would always exist, the unspoken promise that family meant showing up for one another, no matter what. As I turned each page, another realization surfaced, quieter but just as powerful. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped expecting much from him, telling myself that this was what independence looked like. I had lowered my emotional needs to make things easier for everyone else. I rarely asked for time, for visits, for reassurance. I told myself I was being mature, supportive, understanding. But in doing so, I had also taught him that I would always be fine with less. And now he was simply acting on the version of me I had shown him. That afternoon, a friend called, someone who had known me long before I became mom. She could hear it in my voice immediately. The strain I thought I was hiding so well. When I finally told her about the message, she didn't rush to defend him or explain his behavior. She just said, "That must have hurt." Those 4 words opened something inside me. I hadn't realized how badly I needed my pain to be acknowledged, not minimized or justified away. We talked for a long time, about children growing up, about how families change, and about the quiet loneliness that can creep in when you're always the strong one. After we hung up, I sat in silence, thinking about boundaries, something I had always associated with conflict, not self-respect. For years, my boundary had been invisible, flexible, always moving to accommodate others. I wondered what it would look like to set one now, not out of anger, but out of clarity. Maybe it meant being honest about how his words made me feel. Maybe it meant stepping back and letting him experience the space he seemed to want. Or maybe it meant redefining what holidays, love, and connection looked like for me going forward. By evening, I finally felt ready to respond, though not in the way I'd first imagined. I didn't want to argue or accuse. I also didn't want to pretend everything was fine. I began drafting a message, then deleting it, over and over, until the words started to sound like me again. Calm, direct, and truthful. I wanted him to know that I respected his choices, but that they had consequences. That being excluded, especially without conversation, was painful. And that while I would always love him, I also needed to honor my own feelings. Before sending anything, I paused. For the first time since receiving his text, I felt steady. Not numb, not defeated, just grounded. I understood now that this moment wasn't only about Christmas or invitations. It was about the shifting balance between giving and being seen, between loving and losing yourself in the process. Whatever his response might be, I knew I had reached a turning point. I was done shrinking my emotions to fit into someone else's comfort. As I set my phone down, a quiet sense of resolve settled over me. I couldn't control my son's decisions, but I could control how I carried myself through this new phase of our relationship. And that, I realized, was a strength I had earned over a lifetime. Even if I was only just learning how to use it now. The next morning arrived softly, filtered through pale winter light and the quiet hum of the house. I woke with a strange sense of calm, the kind that follows an emotional storm when you finally accept that something has shifted. The phone lay untouched on my bedside table. I hadn't sent the message yet. Not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to be sure my words came from a place of strength, not hurt. For once, I wasn't in a rush to fix things. I let myself sit with the discomfort, trusting that clarity would come if I gave it space. As I moved through my routine, making tea, straightening the kitchen, feeding the birds outside, I noticed how much of my life had been shaped around waiting. Waiting for calls, waiting for visits, waiting for signs that I was still needed. It struck me how quiet the house felt, not in a lonely way, but in a reflective one. This space, once filled with schedules and noise, was now entirely mine. And instead of resisting that truth, I began to wonder what it might offer me if I stopped seeing it as a loss. Later that day, I decided to go for a walk, something I usually postponed when the weather turned cold. The air was sharp and honest, waking my senses as I moved along familiar streets. I passed houses glowing with decorations, wreaths on doors, signs of gatherings being planned behind closed curtains. For a brief moment, a familiar ache surfaced, but it didn't take over. Instead, I felt a quiet determination grow. Just because I wasn't included in someone else's plans didn't mean my season had to be empty. As I walked, memories surfaced. Holidays from years ago when the house was full. When I cooked too much food and complained while secretly loving every second of it. I remembered staying up late wrapping gifts, making sure everyone felt seen. Somewhere along the way, that role became expected rather than appreciated. I didn't resent it then, but now I could see how easily devotion turns into invisibility when it's never questioned. When I returned home, I did something unexpected. I made plans. Not desperate ones, not meant to prove anything, but thoughtful ones. I called a cousin I hadn't seen in years. I checked dates for a small trip I'd always put off. I even signed up for a holiday volunteering shift at a local community center. Each small decision felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd quietly set aside for others. I wasn't running away from my family. I was running back toward myself. That evening, my phone buzzed, not with a reply from my son, but with a message from someone else who mattered. It reminded me that love exists in many forms, and that connection doesn't always follow the paths we expect. I realized then that my worth wasn't tied to an invitation or a holiday seat at someone else's table. It lived in the life I had built, the values I carried, and the resilience I was finally allowing myself to recognize. When night fell, I returned to the message I'd drafted. I read it slowly, then made a few changes, softening where I'd been too careful, strengthening where I'd almost apologized for my feelings. This time, when I hit send, there was no knot in my stomach. Only a quiet certainty that I had spoken my truth with dignity. Whatever came next, I knew I had crossed an important threshold. As I turned off the lights, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not hope tied to someone else's choices, but confidence rooted in my own. The story between my son and me wasn't over. But this chapter was no longer defined by silence or self-denial. It was defined by self-respect. The reply didn't come that night, or the next morning. And for the first time, the waiting didn't feel like punishment. I noticed the absence, yes, but it no longer ruled my mood. Instead, my days began to take on a different rhythm, one that belonged to me alone. I woke early, not out of anxiety, but because I wanted to. I opened the curtains wide, letting the light spill across rooms that had once echoed with voices and expectations. In that quiet, I started to understand how much of my emotional energy had been spent managing other people's comfort, often at the expense of my own. I spent that day sorting through old things, not just drawers and closets, but memories. Photo albums surfaced, filled with moments I had carefully preserved. Birthdays, graduations, holidays where I stood slightly to the side of the frame, smiling, holding the camera, making sure everyone else was captured. I studied those images differently now. I didn't feel bitterness, but I did feel recognition. I had been present for everyone, always reliable, always available. Somewhere along the way, that reliability had been mistaken for endless capacity. In the afternoon, I drove to the community center to finalize the volunteering details. The coordinator greeted me warmly, grateful for the extra help during the holidays. It was a simple interaction, but it stirred something inside me. A reminder that being wanted feels different from being assumed. There, my time wasn't taken for granted, it was appreciated. As I listened to plans being discussed and needs being outlined, I felt useful in a way that didn't demand emotional sacrifice. It was grounding and surprisingly healing. On the drive home, my phone finally buzzed. I pulled over before reading the message, giving myself a moment to breathe. When I did open it, the words were brief and careful, polite, even, but distant. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of how much his message had hurt. In the past, that would have crushed me. This time I felt something different, clarity. His response told me exactly where he stood. And instead of scrambling to bridge the gap, I accepted the distance for what it was. That evening, I cooked a meal just for myself, something simple but intentional. I set the table properly, lit a candle, and ate slowly. It wasn't about pretending everything was fine. It was about honoring myself in the moment I was in. I realized then that loneliness and solitude are not the same thing. Loneliness comes from feeling unseen. Solitude can be a choice, a space where you finally see yourself. As the night settled in, I reflected on how much I had changed in such a short time. Not dramatically, not loudly, but deeply. I hadn't stopped loving my son, and I probably never would. But I had stopped shrinking to fit into the version of the relationship he found convenient. That shift felt monumental. For the first time, I wasn't measuring my worth by how needed I was, but by how whole I felt. Before bed, I wrote in my journal, something I hadn't done in years. I wrote about grief, about disappointment, but also about strength and rediscovery. I wrote about the kind of future I wanted, not defined by holidays spent waiting for invitations, but by days filled with meaning, connection, and self-respect. When I finally closed the notebook, I understood something clearly. This wasn't the end of my story. It was the moment I reclaimed authorship of it. The days that followed carried a quiet steadiness, the kind that doesn't announce itself but slowly rearranges your inner world. I stopped checking my phone first thing in the morning, and instead made it a habit to step outside with a cup of tea, letting the cool air remind me that life continues whether or not someone chooses to include you in it. There was grief still, yes, but it no longer sat at the center of everything. It had moved to the side, like an old ache you learn to live around rather than fight against. I began to notice how many decisions I had postponed over the years, always waiting for the right moment, the right approval, the right sense that my choices wouldn't inconvenience anyone else. Small things at first, rearranging the living room, donating clothes I had kept, just in case, signing up for a short course I'd once dismissed as impractical. Each decision felt like a quiet rebellion against the version of myself that had learned to disappear politely. One afternoon, a neighbor stopped by, someone I had exchanged greetings with for years but never truly spoken to. We ended up talking on the porch for nearly an hour. She shared her own story, different in details but familiar in emotion. Adult children, shifting roles, the slow realization that motherhood does not come with guarantees. There was comfort in that shared understanding, in knowing my experience wasn't an isolated failure, but part of a larger, unspoken truth many people carry silently. That conversation lingered with me. It made me reflect on how rarely we give ourselves permission to talk honestly about disappointment, especially when it involves our children. Society expects unconditional sacrifice, endless forgiveness, and quiet endurance. But what no one tells you is how damaging it can be to deny your own pain just to maintain an image of strength. Acknowledging hurt doesn't make you weak, it makes you real. Later that evening, I reread my son's message, not to reopen the wound, but to see it clearly, without emotion clouding my judgment. I realized something important. The words themselves were less painful than the assumptions behind them. That my life revolved around theirs, that my presence was optional, that my needs were negotiable. Understanding that didn't make me angry, it made me resolved. I could no longer build my future on expectations that weren't shared. I started making plans for the holiday season, not as a reaction, but as an intention. Volunteering schedules, a small trip I'd postponed for years, even inviting a few acquaintances over for a simple meal. It wasn't about replacing family, it was about expanding the definition of connection. I reminded myself that belonging isn't limited to blood. It grows wherever respect and kindness are mutual. As night fell, I sat by the window, watching lights come on in neighboring houses, each one holding its own complicated story. I felt a strange mix of sadness and peace. Sadness for what hadn't been, and peace for what could still be. I understood now that loving my son didn't require me to abandon myself. Boundaries, I realized, are not walls. They are doors you choose how and when to open. That realization settled into me gently but firmly. Whatever came next, reconciliation or continued distance, I knew one thing for certain. I would no longer measure my worth by someone else's willingness to show up. My life was still mine, And for the first time in a long while, I was finally living it on my own terms. As December moved closer, the world around me grew louder with celebration. Store windows glowing with lights, music drifting through aisles, conversations filled with plans and expectations. For the first time, those sounds didn't stab at me the way they once would have. Instead, they passed through me like background noise, reminders of a season I could now shape differently. I stopped seeing the holidays as a test of who showed up for me and started seeing them as a stretch of days I was allowed to fill with my own meaning. I spent time reflecting on the years when I bent myself into smaller shapes just to keep peace. I remembered how often I stayed silent when something hurt, how quickly I brushed aside disappointment with excuses made on other people's behalf. At the time, it felt like love. Now I could see it more clearly. It was fear dressed up as sacrifice. Fear of being alone. Fear of being labeled difficult. Fear of losing what little connection remained. Naming that fear took away much of its power. One evening, I took out old photo albums, not to torture myself, but to reclaim my own history. I lingered on pictures of younger me, smiling at events, holding babies, standing quietly at the edge of group photos. I noticed something I'd never paid attention to before. I was always present, always supportive, always there. Even when others drifted in and out, I stayed. That constancy wasn't something to be ashamed of. It was a strength, even if it hadn't been honored the way it deserved. I also allowed myself to imagine different outcomes without guilt. What if my son never apologized? What if our relationship remained distant? Instead of spiraling, I found myself strangely calm. I realized that I could grieve the relationship I wished we had without destroying the life I still possessed. Acceptance didn't mean approval. It meant refusing to live in emotional limbo forever. During that time, I wrote a letter I never planned to send. In it, I said everything I'd swallowed over the years, the pride, the hurt, the love, the disappointment. Writing it wasn't about confrontation, it was about clarity. It helped me understand where my responsibility ended and where his began. When I folded the paper and placed it in a drawer, I felt lighter, as if I'd finally returned a burden that was never meant to be mine alone. The days grew shorter, but my sense of self felt steadier. I started sleeping better, laughing more easily, making plans without checking how they might affect someone else's schedule. It surprised me how quickly life responded once I stopped shrinking myself to fit into places where I was barely tolerated. I knew there was still one chapter left in this story, some moment of reckoning, resolution, or quiet closure. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of it. Whatever came next, I trusted myself to face it without begging for permission or approval. I had learned something essential. Love that requires you to erase yourself is not love you are obligated to keep chasing. And with that understanding firmly rooted inside me, I stepped forward into the season ahead, not as someone waiting to be chosen, but as someone who had finally chosen herself. Christmas morning arrived quietly. There were no rush phone calls, no last-minute expectations, no ache of waiting for a message that might never come. I woke up slowly, letting the stillness settle around me. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel abandoned by the silence. It felt honest, peaceful, meaning. I made coffee and sat by the window as the sky lightened, watching the world begin its day. Somewhere, families were gathering, traditions unfolding as they always had. Instead of envy, I felt a gentle sense of detachment. Their joy didn't threaten mine. I had learned that fulfillment didn't have to look the same for everyone to be real. Later that morning, my phone buzzed. Just once. A short message. No apology. No explanation. Simply a few polite words wishing me a nice holiday. I read it, set the phone down, and didn't rush to reply. That pause mattered more than any response I could have sent. It was proof that I no longer needed to perform gratitude for crumbs of attention. I thought about all the years I had centered my worth on being needed, being the one who showed up, who fixed things, who stayed. Letting go of that identity felt strange at first, like stepping outside without a coat. But standing there now, I realized I wasn't cold. I was free. In the afternoon, I went for a walk. The air was crisp, the streets calm. A neighbor smiled and wished me a Merry Christmas, and I returned it without forcing cheer. It was enough to simply be kind, present, and real. I didn't need a table full of people to validate my existence. That evening, I cooked a simple meal and lit a candle. I raised my glass, not in bitterness, not in defiance, but in quiet acknowledgement of everything I had survived. Loss, rejection, silence. And still here I was, whole, standing. I understood then that the greatest gift I had given myself wasn't independence or resilience. It was permission. Permission to stop chasing affection that came with conditions. Permission to age without apology. Permission to build a life that didn't revolve around being accepted by those who had already decided not to see me. This story doesn't end with reconciliation or dramatic revenge. It ends with something far rarer, self-respect. And from that place, whatever comes next, whether connection or continued distance, will be met on my terms, not theirs. I closed the night with a simple thought, one that felt steady and true. I may have been uninvited, but I was never unwanted.